We have two wonderful speakers today, both part of Texas A&M University. And our first speaker is Dr. Barbara Gestel, who is a coordinator for also the program in Science and Technology Journalism at Texas A&M University, a very unique program we have here. She is also a professor at the Veterinary Integrative Bioscience and of Humanities in Medicine. She received her MD and MPH from Johns Hopkins and did an American Association for the Advancement of Science Mass Media Fellowship at Newsweek. Following these, she then worked in communication and administration at the NIH, taught science writing at MIT, and spent 2 years teaching in China and was assistant dean for teaching at the UCSF Medical School. At Texas A&M, her teaching includes courses in science reporting, science editing, and research writing, and she is the lead author of the current 9th edition of How to Write and Publish a Scientific Paper, and has written many other books, chapters, and articles on communicating science. She is a fellow for AAAS and a recipient of the Sigma Chi John P. McGovern Science and Society Award. Sigma Psi, sorry, my bad. And without further ado, Barbara, if you would like to sort of start your speech or your topics, and then we'll get going.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me pull up my slides. Can people see my slides?
Yes, we can see your slides.
Okay, good. And let me hide the controls, and we will be starting. And so first of all, want to mention that these slides will be available if anybody wants a copy. I think you can contact the organizers, or you can email me and I'll be glad to send a PDF of the slides. And so to get started, I'm going to be talking about principles of popular science communication as a foundation for science policy conversations. And so one of the basic questions may be, why is skillful science communication part of a science policy communications toolkit? And I think for many reasons, and let me mention a few of them. One is simply that it provides a foundation of sound knowledge on which to build policy discussions. It also models logical thinking of the type that should be used in policy making. In talking with people or writing for people, it helps establish respect and establish rapport. And thereby it helps promote trust, which is really important for policy discussions. And accordingly, it opens the way for dialogue, and it invites engagement and action. And there may be other reasons too, but I think this is certainly a start for making the case for having good popular science communication skills. And so in terms of this, let me present 15 principles to keep in mind in such communication. And afterwards, I will also present some resources, because clearly in the time available, we can't really go into depth regarding the principles and others. And so one of them is simply to know your audience. Sometimes people talk about communicating with the public as if the public is uniform, but really there are so many different individuals in different subgroups. And so, knowing the educational background and the values and other aspects can help gear the message specifically to the audience, which I think is key to effective communication. And accordingly, the next tip is to relate the content to the audience's knowledge and interests. For example, if someone has marine interest, is it mainly an academic interest? Are they interested mainly in fishing? Are they interested in physical environment? If they are interested in climate, what are they interested in tying it to their interests? And I think keeping in mind that people are not empty vessels or blank slates, they bring knowledge, often a lot of knowledge, though maybe not of the subject, and bring interests. And so building on them can make for effective communication. And in that regard, analogies can really be helpful. If you can make analogies to things that people already care about, or relating things to people's values. I mean, if it's marine policy, do they really have mainly an economic interest, or is it more related to, you know, to values or aesthetics? And I think one thing I would say, and I guess these are maybe somewhat marine metaphors, don't water things down, rather build bridges. I think when people try to water things down, they're still undigestible. They're just sort of an insipid broth, and it comes across as condescending. And I think particularly, let's say, dealing with policymakers, they don't want to be condescended to. I don't think anybody does. So rather build bridges, relate what you are saying to what people already know about and care about. And that way they have a schema for understanding and appreciating things and remembering them. Another principle is to include human or near human interest. So perhaps a policymaker or member of the public who maybe is voting on policy may not be all that interested in principles and theories, but most people are interested in other people or in appealing animals. And so mention people, and include pictures of people. For example, here we have Sarah Carney, who is in charge of the communications group at Sea Grant. Or here we have a picture of a sea turtle from the website. And I think people often get a lot more interested in people or excited about sea turtles than they do about, let's say, theories or equations. And something that's related is to include narrative. In other words, to tell stories. And if you have people and animals, it's a lot easier to tell stories like for example, the wonderful stories that have been told about sea turtles in recent months. And stories, they tend to be engaging. People want to know what happened. They want to read or hear the stories, and they tend to be memorable. I think most of us will remember a story a lot more than, let's say, a list of points to remember. But one caveat, I would say, little stories or anecdotes, they should supplement evidence, not substitute for evidence. I think sometimes people without a scientific background will just tell a story of one instance and say, well, therefore, that's how it always is. And that's not good reasoning. But if it's something that's supported by good scientific evidence, and then a related story can sort of bring it to life and illustrate it, it can be very helpful. Another pointer is, or principle, is to carefully pace the presentation of content. I think often, let's say, if we're from the sciences and we're very familiar with the science in the field, we're all very familiar with it and we can rattle it off really fast. But someone who's not familiar with it needs some time to digest it. So pace things. Let's say there's a hard concept. Follow it with maybe some examples or lighter things. Give people time to work it through before there's the next hard concept, so people don't feel like they're underneath Iguazu Falls. I would say, in general, keep the language simple. Notice I didn't say avoid all technical terms. Sometimes even in the lay audience, it can be helpful to use some technical terms, but in general, keep the language fairly simple. Use mainly simple, common words, minimize technical jargon. And if there are terms that are worth maybe the public's knowing because they will encounter them later, often you can introduce them gently. One technique I really like is presenting the concept first, and then say, for example, well, this process is called such and such, and that way doesn't scare people off. Or if it's, let's say, a long document, providing a glossary can be very helpful. Another thing is to use familiar units that I think in science we're used to using the metric system, but a lot of the American public is not. And so if things are presented in metric units, they may be confused or feel insufficient. So I think translating things to familiar units or providing both units can be helpful. Another thing that's helpful is to round off numbers, makes it easier for people to grasp. And note, I didn't say avoid all numbers. Members of the public can process some numbers. I mean, look at the sports pages, how many numbers there are. So it's not that people can't deal at all with numbers, but making them simple enough, not too many, close together. Another suggestion is to state general concepts before details. I think a lot of times those of us in science, we're so familiar with the material that we just dive right into the details, and so start talking about the twigs on the trees without letting people even know what forest we're talking about. And sometimes a reminder we need is present the big picture first before getting into the details. Another thing is examples can be really, really helpful in illustrating things to people, making it more concrete. And it's also sometimes helpful to use non-examples because to help people see the breadth or narrowness of the concept. So let's say talking about marine mammals, may give some examples of marine mammals, but then say, well, some people might think that because elephants like water, they're marine mammals, but they are not. And so that can help people learn the criteria for classifying things. Another thing that's really helpful is making the relationships of ideas here. Again, if you're talking in a scientific field you know well, you may be able to get a piece of data and then jump to a conclusion about what that means. But for someone who's not in the field, may need to walk through, well, we found this, which means this is happening, which means this is happening too. And therefore, it would be a good idea to do such and such. So showing the reasoning. Another thing that's really helpful on keeping people on track is using transitional words and phrases. For example, first, second, third, or in addition, or however, or in contrast. So it's clear what the relationships are. And perhaps use diagrams. Simple diagrams can help make relationships clear to the many people who are largely visual learners. Another thing is respectfully counter misconceptions. I think there are lots of misconceptions about all kinds of science, including marine science, but just saying to people, oh, that's stupid. I can't believe you believe that, things like that. People tend to just stop listening, then they're affronted, they may be embarrassed, but rather showing some respect in countering misconceptions. And let me mention an approach that over the years has been recommended by a colleague of mine who's recently retired from George Mason University. This is Kathy Rowan, who's a communications scholar. And she calls it a transformative explanation. And these are the steps. So first of all, state what the common view is, or a widely held view that the person has. But then rather than immediately saying, that's stupid, acknowledge its plausibility. Say, well, given such and such, I can understand, why many people think that. But then respectfully show its deficiencies and share the more scientifically founded view. And so this can be a way of sort of persuading people without having them lose face and or having a lot of resistance. Another thing, again, is to consider providing visuals, can make it more attractive, can help people learn, can help people remember. But again, keep them simple, something that someone, who's not a specialist can grasp. So if it's a graph, perhaps, just a simple line graph, simple bar graph, don't expect people to be interpreting semi-logarithmic plots or very, very complex graphs or tables. Another thing to suggest, and I think this is helpful in dealing with policymakers, is consider putting something in writing, whether it be something you hand out or have an email or a link to, for people to remember things, give them something written to refer to later. And also provide access to further information, often in talking with policymakers or let's say congressional staffers. They may not have a lot of time, but the ideal thing is get them interested and motivated and then give them access to learning more, where be it through links to websites or other materials. If you're giving written materials, design them for easy readability. I think, for example, congressional staffers and others, they're busy and may have only time to skim. And certainly, let's say the Congress people they're working for may not be able to pore over your 400-page report. And so let's say you're doing an executive summary or handout or something. In general, avoid long sentences, which tend to bog people down. And similarly, avoid really long paragraphs, which tend to be intimidating. And some things to consider using, if appropriate, is one, subheadings to break material down and make it easy for people to find what they're looking for. Bullet or numbered lists can make for quick reading. Some boldface, but not too much, some italics, but not too much. If they're overused, you can't tell what's really important. It just is cluttered, but occasional boldface or italics. Also sometimes sidebars or text boxes, sidebars being little articles next to the main one, or as we said, text boxes can help. And then my last principle is to check with the audience, whether it be in conversation or if you're designing, let's say, an important document, you may want to have people look at it and provide feedback. And this was an example. This was testing a website in a workshop in Africa that we did. And first of all, we have the confused person scratching his head, and then sort of the light goes on. Okay, I see what's going on. And he points to the information. So those were sort of 15 basic principles. And now let me move into some resources if you'd like to explore these principles more and explore related materials. Some of you may be familiar with the plainlanguage.gov website. And this is also a great website for advice on communicating non-governmental content about science and related topics. So really recommend this website. And then some other websites. The American Association for the Advancement of Science has a communication toolkit online, and this actually includes some things specifically on communicating with policymakers. And there's also a very good website called the Open Notebook, which is guidance more generally in doing popular science writing. There also are a variety of really helpful books if you're interested in writing or otherwise communicating about science for the public. One recent one, The Craft of Science Writing, is based largely on material in the Open Notebook website. An older book, but one that I think is particularly good, is called Ideas into Words, and it's by the person who for many years edited the Johns Hopkins University magazine. In terms of blogging, there is a good book, Science Blogging, The Essential Guide. And then there's a new book that came out just this summer called A Tactical Guide to Science Journalism, which has chapters by various people on various aspects of communicating science to general audiences. Also, for any of you who may be at Texas A&M or otherwise be interested, there are a variety of courses here at Texas A&M that are open about communicating science to general audiences, and they are open to all graduate students and actually to upper level undergraduate students with permission. And for people elsewhere, I'm glad to share syllabi and have people, for example, do the reading on their own. And every fall we have a course on issues in the topic, a course in general science reporting course, and a biomedical reporting course. And if there are people here who still have some flexibility in their spring schedule, we have 3 courses. One is a research methods course in the field. There is a course in risk and crisis reporting, which I will be teaching, and I think some of this, the material can relate pretty closely to marine policy communication. And also this spring, I am teaching a course in science editing. I think internships are also a really good way to develop communications skills for communicating science. And of course, there are a variety of policy internships, and I won't list these here, but in terms of internships, there are external opportunities. I think in the introduction, Tacey mentioned that I was a AAAS Mass Media Science and Engineering Fellow, and this is, I think, a really good program. It's specifically a program for graduate students in the sciences and places people at media sites for the summer. And there are other established opportunities. A variety of places have science communication internships. And sometimes even if a place doesn't have an established internship, if it's a place you might be interested in interning, sometimes you can contact them and something can be set up. I know through our graduate program, we often do that. And then internal opportunities also for internships and related items. I know Texas Sea Grant has had communication interns, and in fact, I'm very pleased that one of the interns from our program is now a member of the communications group. Texas Water Resources Institute has hosted quite a few interns over the years, and there are also other internal internship opportunities at A&M and associated entities. And then also, sometimes there are communication-oriented student worker positions or graduate assistantships and so forth, for example, in some of the communications offices at A&M. So if you're interested in getting more experience in this regard, there are lots of opportunities. And then also, I think reading lots of good science communication or viewing or listening to it is a great way to intrinsically develop skills, even if you're not actually analyzing things, just sort of get a sense of what works. And there's a yearly anthology, Best American Science and Nature Writing. The 2022 one came out just earlier this month, and there are volumes going back quite a few years now. Also, there are a bunch of science writing awards, and I find looking at the lists of those is a great way to identify great science writing, and often the lists have links to the stories that won the awards. So, for example, just this month, this year's AAAS Kavli Science Journalism Awards were announced and have a link. National Association of Science Writers has two groups of awards, Science in Society, which is for journalism per se. And then the last few years also have had Excellence in Institutional Writing Awards, which is for writing from universities, government agencies, and so forth. And a few other resources on communicating science widely, variety of organizations. And for the students here, some of them have really good student membership rates and also very reduced registration rates for the conferences. There's the National Association of Science Writers. Society of Environmental Journalists is a group that may be particularly relevant today, and Association of Healthcare Journalists, among others. And some of you may be familiar with ComSciComm, which are science communication workshops that are for graduate students and organized by graduate students. And every year for at least the last several years, they've had a Houston version. And here is a poster from the one in 2021 that had the pleasure of speaking at. And another chance to practice popular science communication skills is the 3-minute thesis competition every year at Texas A&M and on other campuses as well, where people basically have 3 minutes to explain their thesis or dissertation in lay language. And this year's competition just ended, but for anyone here, if you're going to be a graduate student next year, I think it's a great chance to have some practice in this regard. And so I think we'll be leaving the questions and comments till after our next presentation, but I hope these principles and resources will serve as a helpful foundation for science policy conversations. And again, for more information, please feel free to contact me. And so, thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Barbara. That was a wonderful presentation. Like Dr. Gestel mentioned, we do have those slides that are available. If you are interested in them, we are more than happy to send them out, or you can contact her directly. And I just want to make a note as well, for many of those internship opportunities or even courses, there are similar courses across many institutions. It just requires a little bit of investigation. And sometimes asking faculty in those departments can give you a better idea of a class you may not have seen as a science communication opportunity, but might have a little bit more than you're expecting. So definitely something to look into if you're earlier on in your degree or you have some space in your schedule, because it is a really great opportunity to see something from a different perspective. All right, with that, we will move on to our next speaker, and we'll do this second presentation here sort of back to back, and then give everybody a chance to ask some questions, or if you would like more information on experiences or those kinds of opportunities as well. So our second speaker is going to be Dr. Leslie Rule, who is a research scientist and works in the Department of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service here at Texas A&M. She is also a founder of Conservation in Action. She is an ecologist working across disciplines to create innovative solutions in regions of conservation, conflict, and development. She holds a PhD in ecology from the University of Georgia and has served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ghana, West Africa, and managed university-based initiatives for both NSF and USAID. Having lived in 4 countries and traveled to more than 90 countries during her career, she has a broad experience in international applied conservation and research, including stints at the Savannah River Ecology Laboratory, Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama, Honduran Coral Reef Foundation, Applied Biodiversity Science Program, Earthwatch, and the Center on Conflict and Development. Her work has already been recognized with the UN's Equator Prize Initiative and Dean's Award for Interdisciplinary Teams. And she currently has 3 programs that she focuses on, including human-wildlife conflict in Botswana, marine conservation, and an entrepreneurship program in the Eastern DRC. And without further ado, Leslie, if you'd like to go ahead and get started.
All right, thank you very much. Let me make sure I have my right presentation that I'm sharing. Share. All right, there we go. All right, well, so I'm so excited to be talking to you all today and super excited to be following Barbara. She's had so many great resources and so many great things to share with you all. I wanted to sort of reiterate some of the things she said. In my work with USAID, I worked quite a bit with AAAS fellows who had just finished their PhDs and were really into putting science into policy. And that was a super fantastic experience for them. A lot of them were working on conservation in Africa because that's where a lot of my work is at. And then I wanted to give a plug for my class. My class I teach over at the Bush School. It's called Women, International Development, and Environmental Conflict. And what I try and do is I try and have scientists and policymakers in the same class and then trying to learn each other's languages, because I think that's one of the really important things that Barbara totally highlighted on her very fantastic presentation on principles. So yeah, want to take my class, give me an email and I'll tell you the information. I only teach it in the fall. So yeah, after that really excellent foundation on the principles of communicating science, I really want to help you think a little bit more broadly and creatively about different ways that you can not only communicate your science to a non-science audience, but also how to encourage action based on that science for your audience. And someone in the beginning wrote about Twitter, and totally agree. I think there's so many different ways you can influence policy right now. There's Twitter, there's Instagram, there's Facebook, a multitude of others, Mastodon, a lot of different ones are coming available to us as science communicators, and it really provides you a platform. And that is good and bad, right? There are some issues that you have to be really aware of with that. So there we go. And so I want to start with a story that I'm sure several of you already know about. It's about our friend, Dr. Christine Figuener, and the amazing influence that a video that she made has had on plastics in the world. So her work on olive ridley sea turtles really made a detour. She wasn't necessarily studying plastics in oceans, but she found this turtle, she and her team found this sea turtle and didn't know, I'm sure lots of you have seen the video, but if you haven't, you should look it up. But this pretty dramatic video of her and her team pulling this straw out of a turtle's nose. They didn't know what it was at first, and that's part of what's happening in the video. But this video has created this amazing platform for her to talk about single-use plastics, even though that wasn't necessarily her aim at the time. But I will tell you, I'm a scuba diver as well. And now when I go out and I go to Indonesia, Thailand, Fiji, all these different places around the world, people are using bamboo, and paper straws instead of plastic straws. Even my mom, who lives in Montana, which doesn't even have an ocean by it, she uses a metal straw. And this was all inspired by this video that was taken and uploaded. So just seeing the actual effects of pulling one straw out of the nose of one turtle really changed the discourse. And it's not like we didn't have scientific papers out there. We didn't have people that knew plastic was a problem in the environment and it was a problem for marine animals, but it was this video that really inspired that action. So now the serendipity, one needs to have a phone or a camera ready when something like this happens. And in her case, she almost ran out of charge on her battery. But How do we help our data come alive and become relatable and help inspire action for non-scientists in our work? So I would like to introduce you to Hans Rosling. Hopefully several of you know who he is already. He'd started a website that, again, got a lot of traction after he did a TED Talk called The Best Stats You've Ever Seen. And he created this site, Gapminder, with his son and his daughter-in-law back in 2005. 2006 is when this video came out, and it's one of the most watched TED Talks of all time. It has over like 15 million views. And this is a really great place to start exploring for inspiration on how to share your data. Right? They've got an excellent resources page where you can make your own graphs, where you can use some of their data. You can make different bubbles and graphs and maps showing some of the information, but in this infographic way. So what is an infographic? You know, I'm hoping that this has inspired you to think about communicating your data in different ways. Now, infographics are one of the very simple ways we can do that. And what is an infographic? It is basically just a visual representation of data. And its most basic form, it can be a pie chart, it can be a bar graph like you see here, but you can also have so much more fun with that. And that's what I'm really going to encourage you to do here. By having these fun, beautiful infographics, then you can use these different platforms of a Twitter, of an Instagram, of a Facebook, where you can share your story using these infographics. And the idea is to have just a really easy to understand format that takes a complex issue and makes it into an interesting story. And that's really the power of the infographic, is how to share a lot of information, your data, in a really clean and impactful manner to your reader. Now, I started thinking about infographics way back in grad school. My friends and I in the lab, we were just sort of going around the website and we found this map, which if any of you are following Texas A&M football right now, this maybe isn't a surprise to you. But at the time, I was quite shocked to look at the highest paid public employees. And if you look at this graph, you can see football are the ones in yellow, basketball in orange, there's one hockey in green, and then the blue ones are not in coaches. But I thought this was a really powerful way of looking at this information. If I'd seen it in a list, I don't think it would have been as impactful. I think one of the really interesting things that are important about infographics is it sort of draws you in. So I think this one, you're like, oh, wow. So basketball, you know, California is a basketball state, maybe Indiana is a basketball state, maybe football is rules in most of the states. But I thought this was one of the really powerful infographics that really made me think more about how to share this information. Here's another one. If you look across the world, only 22 countries that Britain hasn't invaded. And if you look at it in this form, it sort of is more powerful than if you were just to see that in a list or read it in a sentence. I think this is the power of infographics and thinking about how you use your data in a way like this that really conveys the information. Again, another very, very simple one. Countries that do not use the metric system. Right? Going back to what Barbara was saying about units. What should we think about what units we're using when we're discussing and sharing our science with someone else? And again, if we want to get a little more complicated, but still keep it simple, there's visualizing global population density. A very simple one that says there are more people living inside this circle than outside of it. Or visualizing the true size of Africa. Again, these are very simple infographics, but I think they're the ones that draw you in and have you look at a picture that relays the information in a much more profound and impactful way than they would if you were to read this in a paper or look at it on a list. Another one that if you get a little more information that you want to share. This one's about paid maternal leave. Yeah, United States is only one of 8 countries that have known parental policies that don't have paid leave. So being able to compare across a bunch of different countries by looking at this graph. It makes it a lot more powerful when you see who doesn't have paid leave. And going back to the number one principle that Barbara talked about, who is your audience, right? So there's going to be different people that you want to influence with your work. And that really depends on what you're trying to do. So for me, what the first thing that I think you should do when you are creating these alternative types of communications, right? So with an infographic, you really need to think about who is your audience and what information is most important for them to understand and feel like it's actionable. So here's like an interesting graph about moose crashes in Maine. And so this is put together and trying to influence the Maine Department of Transportation on moose crashes. And so they have their information displayed in time, in number of crashes, they have the areas and the towns and the years, right? So there's a lot of information in a short, easy to read graphic that's not so simple that you just kind of go skim by it, but I think it's another one that really draws you in. So if this was a topic that you're interested in understanding, you can actually look at this graphic and figure out ways that you could intervene. So let's look at some other examples and see how they share their information. There's a really interesting website that I'll share with you at the end of the presentation as well, but it's called Visual Capitalist. And they put together a lot of really interesting infographics, and they also have some tools that you can use. This is one on wealth in Africa. And this is one I like to talk about when I'm in my classes, because then students can look at this and you can ask questions and you understand the continent and the wealth distribution in a different way than if we were just to talk about it. So a lot of the work that I do is doing conservation and international development. And so this is one of the ways that you can look across the continent and see how wealth is distributed. You can also look at different people that are influenced by this wealth or have control of the wealth. And this might be another way that you could really draw in some of your readers if you are sharing this on a Twitter or an Instagram or a Facebook, or this could be another way of doing a poster, right? But this is an easily shareable piece of information that really packs a lot into a little tiny spot. This is another one that I think that students it's really resonated with them about mapping distribution of income by religious belief. And this is another one that you can spend a lot of time just looking at the numbers and understanding what's happening. So this is talking about income brackets. If you look at the different colors, and then it talks at the bottom, and I think it's also a really nice feature that they have is they have what the house of worship sort of looks like. And then the distribution of the income by the religious belief. So this is not necessarily the topic that I'm trying to share, but it's much more a really visually interesting way to understand this information. Sometimes I think you can have infographics that might have too much. And I think this is one of those examples that has maybe a little too much, all smashed into one graphic. Right. And then you also have the cutout in the middle where you're obscuring some of the other countries so you can't see them quite as well. So I think there is a really fine line between having too little and having too much, and trying to make sure that you have and going back to Barbara's principles, having those clean lines of communication, really understanding who your audience is and what the outcome of this sharing of your information is supposed to be. I think this might be on the opposite end. Now, this might be an infographic that really doesn't share enough information. I think with this one, it leaves you with a lot more questions. And this was created by the United Nations, and they're trying to support people's they're trying to get people to support the United Nations. But in this case, I think that there's just not enough information, and it leaves you lacking and asking more questions and not really necessarily feeling like, oh yeah, UN is really creating a better world every day, like it says. So again, when you're thinking about what information to share, you really want to have that nice balance between what can be a clean presentation of data that's digestible without it being too simplistic, which I think this one is. This one is, I think, depending on, I test this with my students, and this one either is too much or too little, depending on the person that's reading it. So again, this presentation is really dependent on who your audience is. So thinking through who your audience is and how they will feel about understanding this type of infographic. And I tried to put this one in, and it's a really cool infographic because it was on ocean economy, and I could not figure out a way to do it best, but you can look this up. This is about alternative seafood resources in the ocean economy, and it's by Sophie's. I was going to try and have a link in here, and I couldn't quite get that to work, but this is a very interesting one that I thought was really appropriate for this particular audience. The state of democracy, another one. I think this is a little too wordy. This is again that Visual Capitalist website that I was telling you about. And this one I wanted to share with you because now this is becoming more and more done. And this was an taken from a journal article that was published in Nature, which we all know Nature. And so they took the data from this science article and put it into this infographic and shared it with policymakers to try and push more about what was happening with COP27. So looking at climate change and trying to show flood risk and trying to show why we should be making a movement and trying to inspire action about climate change. And then there's another one that if you want to go beyond just your basic infographics, you can also do these animated infographics. And I think those are also really interesting. Here's two of them that I find, really visually appealing that my students have really gravitated towards. One is looking at the global population, and this can be really interesting because you can see in real time how things are changing. You can move the scale back and forth. The wind flows and speeds, we were actually looking at this when there was a hurricane going on. So you can see in real time what the wind flows and speeds are around the US. And these are data that are taken from NOAA and put into these animated infographics. So tips again, how do you make a really good, powerful infographic? Again, start with what you want your overall message to be and have everything tie back to that message. Don't have too much going in to those infographics. Have your audience and your message clearly thought out before you put together your infographic. It needs to be something that's narrow enough. Like I showed you the example, if you have too much going on, you're going to lose your audience. The idea is to be one that really draws your audience in, so they want to study your infographic, but one that they don't feel lost in. And that's really going to depend on who your target audience is. If you're trying to make a policy change, are you trying to influence general public? Are you trying to influence policymakers? Are you trying to influence government officials? Is this something that's going to be presented to a group at Congress, something like that? And no matter who your audience is, it needs to be simple and focused. It needs to be a good balance between the graphics and the text. And I think Barbara, again, had some really great ideas of how you make that balance between graphics and text and how you relate that to your audience. Making it visually appealing. Again, if it's too messy, if there's too much going on, you're going to lose your reader. They're going to gloss over. But if it's really interesting and people can kind of look at the map and kind of look at different things or look at the graphic and they are analyzing what is happening in that graphic, that's the hook that really draws your reader in. And there are so many infographic maker software tools out there. I just have a smattering of them here. And what I really suggest is playing with them. There's several of these that have a free version. Some have the free version and then the more expensive paid version, or if you want to download what you've created, they make you pay for it. We have several that are free here at Texas A&M, and you can play with those. But I think it's really about what you're most comfortable in using and practicing within those to come up with the software tool that really makes the most sense to you. The ones that I've listed here are some of the favorites that my students have used, Canva. And this is because, and it's fun because I've been teaching this class for about 6 years and talking about infographics. And every year students come in with more and more knowledge and experience with it, which just makes me believe that this is becoming a more powerful tool that more folks are using. There's also a few more here that I added, and this is why I added the D3JS. That one is free, but you need programming knowledge. I'm thinking maybe some of you already have some programming knowledge, so this might be something that would elevate it. I know another thing that people have been using are the dashboards. We were looking at creating a couple dashboards for some of the projects I have in Congo and Costa Rica. And these are some of the programs you can use for that. Having this skill is going to make you more marketable. A lot of my students that have gone to work for USAID, they have been asked to create these type of infographics, and not even necessarily just for data, but just having infographics within the presentation and the creation of documents by NGOs and government agencies that make the policy brief look appealing. But you can try all of these. I would be happy to talk about these with you. We also have lots of books. Here's Factfulness. This is a really great book by Hans Rosling. And this is talking all about how to use data, how to make it really impactful and clean. There's also David McCandless. He has a couple books, Knowledge is Beautiful and The Visual Miscellaneum. These are really great books that have lots of examples in here to inspire you and give you examples of different ways that you can share your data that are most appropriate for you. And then I have the infographics for dummies. That one's electronically available. Lots of different ways of looking at this. And there's lots of there are a lot of resources at Texas A&M to help you with this. I think the hardest thing for students is just to dive in and do it. I know I have my first assignment in my class is a typical policy brief, one that you'd be traditionally asked to provide. I think it's very important for everyone to understand how to create that. The second one in my class is to do an infographic, something like we talked about today. And the third one kind of relates back to that question we had in the beginning, is I really am encouraging students to think about how is communication changing, thinking about your audience, and your audience that includes the demographics, right? So an Instagram may not be the best way of communicating with your grandparents. My dad is actually addicted to TikTok, so he's all over TikTok, and he's always sharing things with TikTok with me. So thinking about what is going to be a really influential way of getting your information out there, I think is important. I think infographics is a really great way of doing it, but I also really encourage all of you to think creatively about how to share the information and the science that you are doing with a broad audience. And that is all I have for you. And I know we were going to kind of do questions together, so I will take this away. So Barbara is available as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Leslie, very much for the awesome introduction to some of the more visual communication styles as well, because I think that's something that, you know, we don't hear as much about necessarily all the time. So we had a few questions that were raised in the registration previously, and I know, Leslie, you sort of touched on this when you were talking about the Twitter component, but one of the questions that was submitted is essentially, you know, very broad, and maybe we've covered a little bit this, but how do you define science policy communication, and who would you say science communication is generally geared towards, which is very big, broad questions, and they're kind of just like, you know, a little all over the place, but maybe in your personal experience, how would you define those audience and communication styles? Or maybe a better question maybe is, who do you communicate to the most?
Barbara, you go first.
Right, yeah, I think, wow, that's a tough one, but I would say, just off the top of my head, as a broad definition of science, policy communication, it might be sort of communicating using scientific information to people who set policies, set standards, that kind of thing, and it can be, I would say it may be, most obviously, let's say, communicating with legislators or people at the local level who set policies. But I think it can also be setting, let's say, professional policies and things like that. For example, when I worked at the National Institutes of Health, we had consensus conferences, which were conferences on, let's say, areas where there was either controversy or at least lack of agreement on, let's say, what is the most appropriate treatment for something or guidelines. And so I was one of the people who would sometimes be writing these up, and it probably would not go to legislators, but it might go to professional organizations of physicians, and that might be setting their policies. So I would take a fairly broad view about as sort of communicating, scientific information and ideas to groups that can set sort of guidelines or standards.
Yeah, I totally agree with Barbara. I would say you get to decide, you get to define who is your audience, right? Because I think, do you want to talk to the voting public? I think about that quite a bit. And like, do I want to talk to this broad swath of people who will be doing the voting? Or do I want to talk to the people who are legislators who might be doing that? Another one that we talk quite a bit with in my line of work are communities that may not be literate in remote regions, right? So we had one project where we were doing some sort of policy work, but we were doing it by taking pictures we were looking at food insecurity in Guatemala. And we were taking pictures of the plates of food over time for the community. So the community was better able to visualize through their means of communication, how their food changed over time and how they were better able to communicate to us what they wanted for their policy changes within their community. And this policy would be like NGOs and outside aid agencies giving aid. So instead of them, giving, they were able to have that visual representation of it. So for me, you are the one that's deciding who should be communicated to and who your work is going to best make an impact with.
I agree, and it can even be quite close to home, because on our campuses, there are policies set regarding protection against illness or environmental items. And so we may be communicating, to our own campus communities.
Yeah, my friend is working on a bird strike project right now on campus, lights out. And so she and the students are trying to figure out, how do we influence what's happening on campus?
Yeah.
So totally, that's a great example, Barbara.
That's very fair. Very, very good answers, I think, both to a very broad question. Those are the kind of questions that are always the hardest to answer, I feel like. All right, so maybe along the same sort of lines, I guess, talking about campus and things like this, and we mentioned the Twitter aspect, I guess, maybe in a more broad sense, instead of just Twitter, how do you feel like maybe social media has a place in a science communication toolkit, right? I think one of the issues with social media is you get so much diverse information, and not all of it necessarily is grounded in research or results, or maybe, valid conclusions. So how, I guess, do you feel it fits into a science communication toolkit, and how can you best maybe support or convey that validity of information if you're coming from a university or things like that as well?
I don't know if we're allowed to ask Sarah Carney from Texas Sea Grant to say anything, but from what I have seen, Texas Sea Grant uses social media very effectively to communicate with different audiences. And I know she's talked about this kind of thing in my my classes. And so if Sarah is here and wants to say something, I think that would be great.
Sure, I'll come from out of the shadows to say something. We do use social media quite a bit with Texas Sea Grant. And, it is a challenge because there is a lot of information out there. There's a lot of ways to put information out there, and there's a lot of audiences you can reach. So I think the most important thing is to consider who your primary audience is, but then also consider who might also see what you're putting out there. And so that's really going to direct the information that you put together and how you message it. And just be open to feedback as well. If you run into something negative, some negative feedback, I think it's also important to learn from that and learn how to grow and adapt your message accordingly. Sometimes the information you put out there, that's the great thing. And sometimes the tricky thing about social media is you get instant feedback, and that can further inform your message, and it can tell you later, well, maybe I should say this differently, or maybe I should do this a little bit differently. So that's our experience with social media, and I think it's a really great tool, and we've had a lot of success with it.
Well, and a lot of times when I have this infographic as an assignment for my students, it's not neat necessarily to put your citations within the, so maybe citing it with footnotes and endnotes, but finding a way to really cite where your information is coming from when you're putting together an infographic like that, I still think is really important. And I think that's one of the things that hopefully more and more people are thinking about, is where the sources are. And once you have a Texas Sea Grant that you go to them and you see that they have really good data all the time, then they become a trusted source. So when you're starting out and creating your own platform, I think it's really important for you to bolster what you're saying with, peer-reviewed science. So just reading a peer-reviewed science paper is not necessarily easy for the public. But even like when I was at Thanksgiving, I have one of my cousins is a high school teacher, and she has her high school students. Now her sons were asking me when I told them something, and they're like, well, what's the citation on that? So hopefully, it's becoming a more and more accepted thing. So
That's totally fair.
And I think another thing is that social media and other media sort of interact. And certainly there have been many times where I've seen a quick mention of something in a social media feed, and that gets me interested enough to read either the New York Times article or the Washington Post article or the Nature or Science article. So I think thinking about how all of these interact is helpful too.
Maybe along those same lines, when you're talking about communicating science, especially from the social media platform, and if you have, like you were saying, right, Texas Sea Grant puts out a lot of information, so it's a reputable source. Do you feel like then if you're talking about communicating on these platforms, you need to have a sort of really active channel, I suppose, right? Sort of that like constant upload, or is it something that if you're maybe enough sources or citations that it doesn't need to be as consistent? Right? I know for a while there was a big push, like when you're publishing papers, publicizing it on Twitter in that cute little caption format, right? But these platforms go in and out. So how active do you feel like you need to be maybe to communicate effectively on some of these options?
I think different platforms and different types of material have different rhythms, that there are some kinds of platforms where the expectation is it's a steady stream, but then there are others where, a weekly post or even a post only when you publish an article may be appropriate. So I think it's different whether you're on TikTok or whether you're on LinkedIn or something like that.
Yeah, and I would relate that back to your audience. Which audience are you trying to communicate with that?
Right.
That's fair. I appreciate that, because I feel like there's so much pressure with some of that social media aspect, right? It's a little bit daunting if maybe you're not as active or it's not at the forefront of your brain. It does take time, right? This is why there's dedicated positions like at Sea Grant where they do get a little bit more time, exposure kinds of things set off to it. I guess a follow-up question to maybe some of that, and this doesn't have to be just on social media, but communications in general, right? As a scientist, if say you're learning the process of making some of these infographics or making some of these written materials, what's the best way to get feedback from somebody that's not in the scientific community? Is it sort of just taking a go at it and seeing what sticks, or is there a better way maybe to get some internal feedback before you present these materials or post them?
I think in part it depends on how big or how major. I think it is really helpful. I mean, I know a lot of people who, maybe they have a family member or partner or roommate or other friend who, maybe is an English major or something like that and can talk with them. And so I think showing them to some people, I find even preparing my own things and setting them aside for a few days and coming back to them myself. And I think, oh my goodness, this is impenetrable. Why didn't I just say this? So I think oneself, other people, I think if it's something that's really major, let's say some kind of major media campaign, then may want to use more formal social science methods, for example, having focus groups or other things, but that is certainly for something more major and more investment. But then also, once you do have some things out there, monitoring the feedback, seeing what gets comments and what kinds of comments, what gets read can help as well.
I think that's a really great question that I hadn't necessarily thought about. But I'm a huge fan of stand-up comedy, and they were sort of talking about like stand-up comedy where they had these little venues that really, like a Dave Chappelle or like the big names would go to these small venues to test out their material. And the thing that I can think of that would be the best for that would be like your lab group.
Yeah.
Like if you have a really cool lab group or your, the grad student association, maybe trying it out with them. Because, that'll be your harshest critic and your best friend at the same time. And that might be a good way of sort of vetting what you get out there.
I think that's a great idea. Or for anybody here who teaches, even as a TA or whatever, I find that that's helpful. I find a lot of my writing, for example, book chapters and things, they evolve from classes. And like the 6 times I give the class, I finally get it right. And then I can write it up.
Those are very valid points. Yeah. And I definitely think that's something that, it's hard to put yourself out there, especially when you're not comfortable with doing it, and getting feedback helps you feel a little bit more confident and refine your material. I guess another one is sort of along those same lines, right? There's a lot of maybe push in the scientific community for this bilingual concept, right? Being able to talk on the plain language and a policy language, and having them understand the science language and so on and so forth. And I think, one of the things that's lacking is sort of some of that training. It's very hard to learn the terminology if you never interact with the audience until you have to use the terminology, right? So aside from maybe taking classes, let's say maybe you don't have enough time to sink into a whole course or an entire commitment to that level, what's the best way to learn some of that policy language or some of that sort of transition to general science to make your work more approachable or easier to understand?
Darn, you took away my plug for my class. That's what I was going to say. Take my class, because that's my favorite thing to do, is to have the scientists and policymakers in the same room, because it's funny. Everyone is so versed in their own acronyms and their own jargon, and they're just like, blah, blah, blah. And I'm always like, stop. What does USAID mean? Stop. What is IUCN? And they're both like, what? You don't know what that is? What? So it's really fun. And I think that's one of the ways that you get to see it. But if you can't take a class like Barbara's or mine, I think going to conferences and hearing someone else talk, and then you're like, oh, anytime I say an acronym now, I try and follow it up with what it actually means. And a lot of what Barbara's principles were today, I think, really focused on making the language a little more clear and simple. So I think following Barbara's principles is the other great way of doing it.
I think something else is looking at examples. A lot of times there are good posted examples. There actually are some awards for plain language communications. There's like a Plain Language Institute or something that has awards. So I know sometimes in my classes, I'll identify things that have won plain language awards and we'll analyze them.
That's a really good, something I never really thought of doing, but definitely a cool idea. Well, those are both great answers to the question. It's a very broad question, right? I mean, it's hard to sort of, how do you learn it? It's just exposure. It's the same thing in science. You learn, you could become a better scientist as you get more exposure, you do more writing, things like this. So I think it's just a little bit of the practice. And I do think it's getting more and more common. So people are getting more opportunities to practice in our sort of everyday set. I think I just have maybe one or two more questions, and then maybe we'll finish a little bit early today. From a more personal, professional standpoint, however you want to answer this, what do you feel like has been maybe the most challenging thing that you've had to experience to bridge the gap between maybe science and policy, or science and non-science policy, or non-science audiences? Is there like something that really sticks out in your mind of, you're like, wow, I hadn't thought of this or hadn't occurred to me, that was a maybe big difficulty at some point in your career?
I have one, but it's much more cultural, and it was when I was in Peace Corps. I don't know
That's fine.
how relatable this is, but I was doing a conservation project on hippos, and we were trying to bring in clean water and healthcare for people. And I was very excited about providing family planning for the women that I was working with. And when I laid this plan out to the council, one of the men stood up and yelled at me, "Why do you hate our people?" And I was like, I don't understand. He was like, "Why do you not want our women to have babies?" And I had to say, oh, that wasn't what I was meaning at all. So like that cultural divide, I think that's an important one if you're doing international work, is understanding. My lens was, I thought I was providing something for women that would be, and maybe from the women's point of view, it was something they wanted, but my audience and the way I delivered it was completely the wrong way. And it took me a long time to regain the trust of the council, and it was all men on the council. But so then when I talk about family planning and healthcare going forward, I definitely couch it quite differently and feel it out and try and have someone else introduce those kind of concepts rather than myself.
Wow, that's a fabulous example. And having also worked in a variety of countries, I can certainly relate to that. I guess my example, and after yours, mine seems, I think, pretty trivial, but I will mention it because it may be relatable, even though it's not as impactful. I think to me, maybe some of the barrier was in part within myself, which was moving into this field of, popular science communication. I think these days, people talk a lot more about alternative careers in science, and I think it's recognized that science communication is a career path for PhDs and MDs and DVMs, whereas back then it was almost unheard of, and it was, the question of, is this a field that, there'll really be opportunities in? What will people think of me? Do they think I'm, abandoning my science background, that kind of thing? And so I think the hardest thing was, sort of overcoming both my internal doubts and other people's doubts that this was a valid area to work in.
You're a pioneer.
But it's nice to see that these days it is much more recognized. I know when I was a AAAS Science Media Fellow, it was a new program, just a very few years old. And now the program's, I think very well established. And I think, back then there were not science journalism graduate programs, whereas now for quite a few years there have been. So I'm really pleased to see the field coming into its own and people moving, including the people like Sarah, who is one of my graduate students, moving into this field. And if there's anybody listening who's interested in moving into this field, I'd be delighted to talk with you.
I do think that's definitely a more common sort of switch or change or interest, and it's becoming more obvious that there's opportunities, I think, which I do appreciate. We had a career panel 2 weeks ago that sort of talked about some opportunities to sort of move maybe out of academic research and, you know, how those different career opportunities might look and pathways to get there and things like that. So it's definitely a good point. The cultural point is, though, very valid as well from an oceanography standpoint, because most of us do travel to many often remote locations where we just don't have information or data. So having that cultural lens can be a different side of your science and can definitely make things a little bit more complicated in ways you might not have been expecting. So I think those are both really great points. And this isn't necessarily a last question on some of the cultural aspects, but in a way it sort of is. Do you guys have any tips for communicating maybe some of those controversial issues on a public forum, or maybe more touchy subjects where maybe your audience is less receptive to these ideas? Is there like a good way to go about some of that maybe, or do you have any tricks that have helped you to stay maybe a little bit more even keeled, I suppose, on some of these subjects, especially in current?
Right. I think a couple that are in literature and presentations, and I find one is just listen. I think too often we charge in there, you know, with our message without sort of listening. So hearing what people already are thinking, which sometimes go counter to, you know, our assumptions, hearing what people are thinking, what questions they have, what values they are bringing. I think values are really important, because I think in science we're often thinking data, even though we do have underlying values for them, but making explicit what our values are and other people's values are. And I think another one is just finding commonalities, that it may seem we have different views, but there's something that, you know, we both care about, you know, whether it's, you know, the younger generation or the state of the economy or whatever, and trying to find that bond and working together. I know I was recently hearing something about someone who was, I think, very interested in conserving trees and was working with faith communities in that regard, and, you know, realizing that there is a common, even though they come from, you know, sort of different worlds, there's sort of a common value of stewardship, and then working together on conserving trees.
Yeah, and I would build on that. And I feel like one of the things that I've sort of focused on when I'm looking for consensus is trying to find what is motivating the other person or party, what motivates them. So like in Barbara's case, the conservation of trees, maybe mine is that I really care about the trees, but someone else is very interested in the land, right? Or, you know, the private land, or having control of their land, but finding that common motivation, or at least understanding what's motivating them. Then you can sort of understand where they're coming from and balance what your direction is with theirs.
I think that's a great answer. And I think that might be all the questions that I have. If there's any sort of last minute things you guys want to add, or opportunities you know of coming up. For anybody still on this webinar, we are doing, let's say, like a fellowship opportunity webinar next week on the 6th. So if you're interested in some of those major fellowships and some of the programs that, for instance, the American Geophysical Union runs for graduate students, we will do a little bit more in-depth examples of some of those programs next week. But in terms of other opportunities you guys know of for the state of Texas, not even just A&M, you're welcome to sort of put them in here, or if you have any other last minute thoughts, we'd love to hear them.
Well, I'd just like to thank you for this opportunity. I have really enjoyed this, and I have learned things from this. Leslie, I hope you'll share your slides with me. I'd love to use some of these examples in one of my classes. And thank you so much, Tacey, for organizing this.
Yeah, of course. Happy to do so.
Well, I was going to say the same to you, Barbara. I'm like, I loved your foundation principles. I'm like, those are so fantastic. And I had a lot of those in my own notes. So it was so perfect that we presented together. So it was a real pleasure to do this with you. And Tacey, you just did such a great job organizing everything. Very impressed with your professionalism on everything. So thanks for including me in this.
Thank you very much to both of you. We appreciate having you both.